This is the LatinNews Podcast. I'm Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. We have a very special guest to talk all things Brazilian, indeed, inequality and security. His name is Graham Denyer Willis. He is the Professor of Global Politics and Society in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, Fellow and Director of Studies of Geography at Queen's College, Cambridge, author of many books, and, well, an expert on security and inequality in Brazil. So welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's a great pleasure to be here because, we all know Brazil. We know the size, we know the challenges. We've been reading about the election, of course, latter election of Lula, the Bolsonaristas, Bolsonaro now being banned from running again for 2030. Everything seems to be pointing, at least on an international basis, that Brazil is back, whether that Lula wanted to obviously display as soon as he got back into power after the Bolsonaro ruled years. Tax reform, simplifying the complex tax system here in Brazil, fostering economic growth, and so on. But let's talk about inequality a bit and security. I mean, I'm looking at Brazil's news. I'm looking at the 4 million cases of dengue so far in 2024. I'm looking at these titles of 64.2 million Brazilians live in households with food insecurity. And yet, well, murders are down. But people's perception is that violence is up under Lula. Perhaps you could give us, Graham, some sort of idea of what is going on in Brazil.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think, the real puzzle with Brazil is why this amazing country leaves so many people to struggle on an everyday basis, right? And we see that in so many different ways. We see that in questions of dengue, which are really about basic questions of infrastructure and their ability to access healthcare, living in precarious environments, and so on and so forth, right? And I think those things are not disconnected from some of the bigger questions of violence, of acute, interpersonal forms of violence. Of course, there's a very big story that surrounds that recently, which is, around this bigger issue of the rise of particular forms of organized crime groups that exist in Brazilian cities that have spread very widely out of conditions of poverty. And, on the one hand, a lot of people look to these groups and they say, well, these are bloodthirsty criminals who, don't know how to conform to social mores and so on and so forth. But a lot of the research actually shows that the conditions that give rise to these groups are very political. They are longstanding questions of people trying to get by in very difficult conditions. But they're also a story of the way that the expansion of the prison system has itself created criminals. And so that's a big story that surrounds the issue of homicides. For those of us who do study questions of violence, the story of homicides is very much a troubled one, because the assumption really is that if you have a rise in homicides, there is a problem of disorder or a lack of control of police or of the state, over law. So you have an unrule of law, or you have disorder in everyday life. And that consequently, if you have a decline in homicides, the state is doing a good job. Police are doing a good job. But what we know, and it's not specific to Brazil, is that actually sometimes when homicides go down, it's because there is a particular organized crime group that has dominated particular communities, or has found ways to forge alliances with other groups, or has the means to say to people in places that have been violent, you're not allowed to be violent anymore. This is very much the case in Sao Paulo, a city that was very violent for a long time through the 1990s, One of the ways that people have mentioned it is that the time of the war in Kosovo, there were more people dying in the city of Sao Paulo than died in Kosovo, like more than 10,000 people. So it was very significant. But then within a short period of time, the homicide rate declined by upwards of 80%. So today we see around 6,000 fewer people dying from homicides than we do in that period of time. That story replicates itself in troubled ways across different Brazilian cities, all of which virtually have the presence of an organized crime group of some kind, or have it in fragmented ways. Rio de Janeiro has a number of them, plus paramilitary groups, basically. And in other Brazilian cities, there are different ways in which the contestation between groups is a major part of the story of rising homicide rates. So I think there's a troublesome story there, which we need to think about very deliberately and very contextually, and not just in the sense that like it's the state that doesn't have control and we should hope the state has more control, but of the historical conditions that have given rise to people having to solve problems in a way that is ethically slippery and difficult.
And I mean, you've mentioned it on a couple of occasions. I'm seeing parallels through other Latin American countries, you know, sort of regions of the country where in Colombia was less deforestation because it was under the control of the FARC guerrillas. And now in Ecuador, we're looking at President Noboa trying to take full control of the prison system in order to control and, I would say, sort of extinguish the gangs which are strafing the country with their violence. Is that a similar situation that we can see coming out of the prisons in Brazil? I mean, we've seen, you know, heinous documentaries and films about this topic, but it's something that still continues to this day.
I mean, he's a key paradox. You know, we see these crises of prison violence. We see them in Ecuador, we see them in Brazil, we see them in Venezuela, we see them in Honduras, all over the place, right? And often the story is, you know, that the prisons are really bad and people are struggling and there's violence within them. And we know that many prisons around Latin America, in Brazil, it's something like 80%, and the government actually states this outright, are controlled by organized crime groups, right?
Wow.
And yet, the solution seems to be, let's build more prisons, right? So we've got Brazil in the 1970s at a time when prisons figured fairly centrally to public discussion because of the dictatorship, had very few prisons actually, by comparison. We had in the tens, you know, somewhere around 50 to 60 actually. Today, we have more than 1,550 prisons in Brazil.
Wow.
Exponential growth in prison construction across the country. Right. And so this is happening in precisely the same timeline as the rise of organized crime groups in Brazilian cities. So we often are trying to think about what the relationship is between the rise of organized crime and the expansion of the prison system. Right. This issue is something that actually, when we look very closely, we see particular kinds of logics, actually. So one of these groups, called the Primeiro Comando da Capital, in Sao Paulo, is very significant. It's spread around many different states. One of the reasons it's so successful is because it can compel people to pay membership dues on the outside because they fully recognize that they're going to end up on the inside. So membership dues actually serve almost as though they were a form of insurance, so that when people do end up inside, they'll be taken care of. You don't pay them on the inside, you only pay them on the outside. Right. So if you know that you're going to end up in prison and you know you're going to need the protection of that group and you know that they provide good services like beds, clothing, food, things like that, you'll be compelled to pay that membership too. If you sever that relationship somehow, if you make it less likely that people will end up on the inside, and if you make it less probable that they can count on the idea that they're going to need protection on the inside, you're going to change the whole logic of the game. Conversely, if you build more prisons and you put more people in prison, many of whom actually are there for low-level drug crimes, we know that according to statistics, it's something like 72% of the Brazilian prison population is there for non-violent crimes. So things like dealing marijuana, crack cocaine, things like that, but at a level of use. Those people end up amidst the populations of of groups that look to dominate and provide rules and to establish order. And so actually by expanding that population and by looking to the prison as a solution, what Brazil is starting to see is that it replicates the problem. It makes it worse.
So I've been reading about, let's say, the minor actors in this sort of, let's say, the micro trafficking of drugs who get paid a pittance, the boys on the street, the adolescents, and then maybe also get partially paid with the drug itself and become users and then become wrapped up in all this. I can see the issue of them being jailed so young, and also perhaps whilst they're inside, their families have to continue paying from the outside whilst they're in jail. This is an ongoing, let's say, protection racket.
I think that really depends on what you're talking about and about perhaps the group. That's something that I've seen as much less central in my own research. The families are required to pay. There may be ways that they coerce them, to doing that. But I think, in fact, looking at that, it loses sight of the larger story, which is really about those low-level people who are trying to get by on an everyday basis, right? So Brazil, for example, invests vast amount of money in prison construction and policing, in security, incredible amounts of money. The National Development Bank is financing the construction of prisons, right? As though this was somehow a good social policy, as though this is somehow a good solution for Brazil's economic development. But if you look to the forms of social policy, actually, that could ameliorate people's lives, they're basically non-existent, right? I mean, you've got Bolsa Familia, but the amount of money you get from Bolsa Familia is very little, and the thresholds actually are very small, right? So people need to find solutions on an everyday basis for getting by. And if they actually, can find some very imperfect means, to make some money, and perhaps it's with guns, perhaps it's with other things, they may be compelled to do that, right? If the contrary is to fall into food insecurity, for example.
So the left is traditionally seen as poor on law and order, and the right seen as traditionally stronger on it. From that position that people believe violence to have increased under Lula, so people felt safer under Bolsonaro then? Bolsonarista policy? Really?
I mean, I think it's worthy of a good discussion, right? I mean, I think what people often misconstrue here is that the right likes to lever insecurity. They like to lever the idea of security as something that absolutely matters, right? It's something that polls really well. It's something that they can say, wouldn't you want to feel secure in your everyday life? I mean, and let's not forget that was a Clinton policy in the 1990s too, right? So it's the kind of thing that you can speak across classes, you can speak across populations by saying, like, we're going to pander to your sense of insecurity by saying we can make you more secure. Of course, they never really do, but the story is really one of we will keep you in insecure conditions, but we will suggest that we will make you secure, but without really doing it. I mean, the story there also is the same. If the solution is more security, more policing, more prisons, what you're actually doing is just strengthening the logic of organized crime.
Yeah. And if we talk about the megalopolis of Sao Paulo, and the governor Tarcísio de Freitas, of course, a Bolsonaro protege, a potential challenger for Lula in 2026, and with, of course, as you say, the Comando Central there in the prisons, is he doing anything specific to ensure that his, his image remains up there as strong on law and order?
Well, I think it's difficult for him to do it. I mean, he can talk about it, but he has no jurisdiction over policing. That's the jurisdiction of the governor. So what he does will be symbolic. It will be speaking to an idea of what he can do, but actually the ability of him as a municipal person to make any significant dent on that is very limited.
And it brings me back to an age-old question and concern in the region, of course. What is the what is the sort of level of trust in the police and, of course, the military in Brazil? And is there a strong judicial system that people believe that criminals will be brought to justice?
It's another very fraught story, to be honest. I mean, trust in the state in Latin America is not the strong suit, let's say. And there's good reason for that, right? I mean, you have vast numbers of people who live in conditions of informality where their relations with the state have always been very uneven, and they have not been able to count on the state to redistribute goods and services in a way that's reliable. And in fact, the story of urbanization in many Latin American cities is citizens organizing, finding ways and means to connect themselves to water, to electricity, to sewerage, to hiring their own people to remove rubbish. And then when you get to the question of security, right? If you know you can't call the police, or if you know that you're going to call the police and they may show up, and also if they show up, they might extort you as much as they are likely to help you. Then you probably will try to find some alternative means to resolve your disputes. And there's vast amount of interesting research on that story, about how the illegitimacy of the state amongst certain populations has led people to find alternate solutions. And that's a complicated story, but ultimately it leads towards de facto forms of policing in communities that have not had strong relationships with the state.
And the judicial system itself?
The judicial system is also troubled in a lot of ways. It's troubled in the sense it's troubled in the sense that that people don't feel like they can count on it. And that may be true and it may be not true. And I'll give an example. A few weeks ago, we were doing some field research in Mato Grosso, and there was a case along the border with Bolivia where a particular group managed to seize 420 kilos of cocaine out of the back of a truck that was driven by two men. And everybody thought, wow, this is significant. 420 kilos is a lot of cocaine. It's a lot of money on the streets of London or New York, right? And what happened actually was the judge decided to let them off. And that created a total firestorm that we heard about directly from so many different places, from street corner bars to conversations with public security people to to hotel people all over the place who were basically like, why did they let them go, right? We had a conversation with this judge actually, and I read a bit more about it, and he said, well, these people actually didn't have any previous records. They are very humble people who live in the borderlands with Bolivia. And there's no indication that actually they are organizers in a vast global trade in cocaine. These people literally don't have salaries. They get by in the informal economy. And so, putting them in prison actually will do much worse off by them and may in fact lead to greater power of these organized crime groups if we do that, right? But many people don't see that as a possibility or that as a solution. They see, shouldn't we be putting people who are doing bad things in prison? Whether or not their motivations for doing what they did are relevant is a different question. So I think there is a constant contestation about how to make the justice system actually manage the complexities of everyday life, right? Along a border that doesn't have regular outposts, we were able to drive across it and not see anybody, and that people will find ways to get by, and that's in that case within a global circuitry that makes vast amounts of money for some people, and actually. Back to your street level guys, right, who get by on a pittance. They end up being, cannon fodder for the criminal justice system. That's a problem.
It is a problem. I see that kind of decision is incredibly progressive, rather than the black and white. You did wrong, you're in jail. So I find that quite refreshing. In fact, I mean, I suppose the culprits were just drivers. Just drivers making ends meet as well. And a capture of that much cocaine seems like a lot, but in the grand scale of things, of how much is coming through, and it is very interesting to see. In terms of security, in terms of uptick in violence, these gangs in the prisons, their industry is extortion, narco trafficking, people trafficking as well.
I think people try to associate or see an association there, but I actually haven't been able to find much evidence to that case. I do pretty regular work as an expert witness for asylum cases in the United States and in the UK. And some of these cases, I've been asked specifically, can you show that there is a relationship between organized criminal groups like the Primero Comando da Capital or others, and international human trafficking? And the relationship there, as far as I've been able to see, is actually very sparse. It relies on different roots and different practices. I think within Latin America and other ways that may be more significant, but out of Brazil, I've yet to see any relationship in that way.
I think it's fascinating. And would you say that, over time, and especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, Brazil is a consumer country as well of narcotics, as opposed to previously just I would say a transfer country.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And that also extends into Argentina, I imagine, as well. So that this changes the nature of the organized gangs. A local market can be very, very profitable, as opposed to the drugs being seized in an international setting. This is really it's changing. It's changing the dynamic of crime in the region.
Yep. I mean, if you think about it this way, right? The state of Sao Paulo on its own would be the fourth largest country in Latin America, right? So you've got 44 million people or so just in that state. And then you've got Rio de Janeiro next door, which has, 8 million people or something like that. And you have a lot of people whose lives are very complicated and who are there as a kind of market for a lot of these drugs. So there's a huge, huge internal market for very cheap drugs, which come across borders and which are not heavily policed, though we might think they are. And that makes it really complicated. Right. But there's also, of course, an onward trajectory to where those drugs go. And that's a major part of the story. But, ultimately, if you can sell a gram of cocaine in London for, 700 reais, and you can buy it on the streets in Cuiabá and Mato Grosso for 40 reais, there's a lot of money to be made. And unfortunately, prohibition regimes make that profitable for a lot of people.
As I see all of these factors pointing to one main issue, and the issue of inequality in Brazil. In your studies, have you been able to point at solutions for these for inequalities? What does the government of Lula need to do to focus on? We said if the 4 million cases of dengue. I mean, can't even figure out or even imagine how many cases and how many deaths by the end of the year. These poor people just doing anything to make ends meet. And from an academic perspective, where do you lean?
Well, we haven't talked too much about tax reform here, and I'm certainly not that kind of expert. But if you think, I think we're conditioned to think that a budget is a fixed amount, right? So if you have 100% of a budget, you disperse it in different ways, right? And that you are bound by your revenue streams and things like that. So you raise your revenues, everybody hates it, and then you have more money, you can spend the money. So even within that, which I don't think is really the story, even within that, there are very obvious ways that public funds are used in ways that make the problem worse as opposed to making it better. So if we were to take the case of Sao Paulo, on a monthly basis, the state of Sao Paulo spends around $600 per prisoner per month within the state. $600 in the context of Sao Paulo is pretty much around the median per capita wage of people in the state, right? If you look at it within the scope of Brazil itself, that amount of money is right close to around the 80th percentile of per capita income, right? If you looked at how much we're spending on building prisons, on operating them on an everyday basis across the whole country, it's vast amounts of money put into punishing people and, in effect, creating more criminals in a way that is making this problem worse than it is, ameliorating the problem in any way, right?
Mm.
So we don't seem to have a problem plowing vast amounts of money into prisons, which, by the way, are increasingly debt funded. So someone is making profit out of that system. But we do seem to have a problem raising minimum wages ever so slightly, increasing the amount that people get in the Bolsa Familia, which, is something like $50, $40 a month or something like that, right? It's really very minimal. And we do know that actually, if you give people money in conditional cash transfers, or if you find ways to deliver social policies that's effective, the gains for society are gigantic.
Mm.
So I think there's a normative shift that we really have to see, which is why do we want to continue plowing money into punishing people who we know exist in difficult circumstances, and use that money differently in ways that we also have good evidence makes people's lives better. And not just their lives, but actually makes everyone's lives better. Because if in Latin America, everybody lives with fear, everybody is worried about getting robbed on the street, everybody is worried about the drug-addled criminal, why do we want to create more of them, right? Why don't we think about other effective ways to solve that problem? We have the money. The budget might be finite, but we have the budget.
It's an interesting situation. You just, as you say, punishing people, creating more criminals, and yet if we look sort of the international image of Brazil now under Lula, again, we said Brazil is back making however many international journeys, but at home things are very different. The tax reform, what I've read, of course, does aim to increase the funds for the Bolsa Familiar, as you said, but as you it's. I worry because, as I say, I'm looking at the international, well, of course, we know that Brazil is non-aligned, but the international way, we've got in November, the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, a big deal, a really big deal. And then was it 2024? No, 2026 or for 2025, there is the COP30 in Belém. These are troubled cities, the word you use all the time, troubled. And this could once again bring the fore of violence, insecurity, and inequality, that bring it to the fore once again on an international basis. And while this is probably good because Brazil needs to address it, it's also, could paint a very negative picture of this country. I mean, you spend a lot of time in Brazil. Obviously, you move easily around there so long. But how do you feel about Brazil's desire to become, again, a global spokesperson, but without having really addressed the issues at home?
I mean, it's full of paradoxes, isn't it? Right? Full of paradoxes. Lula's plan, as much as, he does a lot of progressive things, the plan for growth is, let's invest in Petrobras. We want to produce more oil. We want to fund new exploration, That's a pretty big statement to make when you are also the country that has the Amazon, right? So how much can you do both of these things, right? So I think there is this story, of course, that, a country like Brazil needs to be able to manage its economy and make do and things like that. But these paradoxes are really very difficult, and they're difficult in people's everyday lives too, right? I mean, that just that you mentioned Belém. I mean, I've been struck. There's a prison very near there that they have tried to rebrand as an environmentally sustainable prison. is the major prison in the state called Americano, and they basically created an economic development zone around it and created a law that said that any company that worked in that economic development zone had to follow the Sustainable Development Goals. Right, so we see this strange conflation of inequality and environmental solutions that are very odd bedfellows. You know, there was Brazil, of course, created the sustainability bond internationally, right? A very interesting thing, and you've got major funders like BlackRock and others who plowed money into it in vast, vast ways to, you know, to try to do something about the environment. But what we're seeing on an everyday basis is that actually, you know, people's logics and reasons for using finite resources for deforestation and things like that is very rooted in longstanding forms of inequality. Right? If you're struggling to eat, you know, and if you see everyone around you living the good life or finding ways to make a lot of money, it's very hard to suggest to people that they shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. And if you don't have rules people can trust in and believe in, then you know, you're enabling them. Right?
And you know, you watch Lula wishing to become or mobilizing himself to become a spokesperson for the region, South America. You know, trying to back up UNASUR a bit. I mean, that could potentially help in transnational criminal gangs. How do you stand on this one?
I mean, I think it's I don't think his heart is in the wrong place. I think he's earnest about these things. I think he's earnest about solving problems of poverty. I think he's hamstrung by the nature of the Brazilian Congress and how fragmented it is and the configuration that he's in now. So, you know, I think he wants working people to have good and dignified lives, and he probably would try to find better solutions than he's developing now. But I don't think his leadership within Latin America actually would change the terms of organized crime itself. I think that's a much more deep-rooted problem of historic forms of inequality and the state basically, you know, being fairly disinterested actually in making people's lives better, even when it's had vast resources to do it. You know, so I think it's hard for a president like him to come in and dramatically reshape the game. But I do think that Latin America calls for government that is, you know, that doesn't pander to security as a thing that, you know, that must matter the most, and that distracts everyone by saying, we will make your lives secure, when actually what they do is, you know, something quite different, right?
Well, and I'm sure I'm sure people are shouting out for him to pursue, and I'll finish with this, pursue the Bukele model, jail everyone, get everyone off the streets. I'm sure there's a large cadre of people asking for this or clamoring for this. It's been fascinating. It's been absolutely revealing to consider how organized crime, systemic corruption, of course, a word we haven't used so far in the podcast, but we all know. And again, as you say, the right likes to lever insecurity, the issue of insecurity that is a constant through Latin America. And so therefore it's a policy promise always from whomever's in opposition, I think. And of course, it's a concern. It's a concern. Actually, I had one final question. We talked about the transshipment of illicit drugs. We mentioned human trafficking, extortion. I did have to ask, what about synthetic drugs in Brazil?
Yeah, they don't have the same footprint. And partially, I think that's a bit about the prohibition regime, right? You know, you don't have a major border that is that changes the value of your drugs in a way that's really dramatic, right? So cheap cocaine is plentiful in Brazil, very plentiful.
And Colombia and Peru produce enough to to flood the market. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time and your profound knowledge of insecurity, inequality in Brazil and the region. It has been an absolute pleasure to speak here on the LatinNews Podcast with Graham Denyer Willis, who is the Professor of Global Politics and Society in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge and a fellow and a director of studies of geography at Queen's College, Cambridge. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge so unselfishly. We've definitely learned far more about the inequality, the business of organized crime, the trust in the police, and so much more. What can Lula do? We will see. As you said, his heart's in the right place. If you genuinely believe he wants to help the Brazilian people, he comes from the background, but so much is against him. So much is he's up against real barriers to changing what is believed to be the solution, building more prisons.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure. This LatinNews Podcast. We produce a podcast every fortnight looking at fascinating topics from the region. Last week, we were talking about Panama, and a fortnight before that, we were discussing Belize as well. So nowhere is off limits. Thank you again, and goodbye.